Jamestown had a high death rate, but here's what your book says, and here's a standard view. Jamestown was the worst place that they could have picked to start a colony. It was a swamp land. It was a land full of mosquitoes. The water was part salty and part fresh, or called brackish. And the Indians were, for the most part, unfriendly. Again, if they would have gone farther north, like eventually did, and started a colony in Massachusetts, you might say, what's so great about Massachusetts? Doesn't it have a lot of cold weather? Yes, the cold weather kills the insects and the germs. That does not happen here. Here in this part, even in the year 2019, we have real problems with mosquitoes. They don't have those problems in Massachusetts, not as much. Of course, today we have better doctors and we can handle a lot of our diseases, but I say that tongue-in-cheek because you hear of new diseases coming along that doctors cannot handle. So, all right, anyway, that's another topic. But sometimes your book says also some of the settlers could not work because they were too sick to work, but a lot of them died. But the first permanent, now I have to use the word permanent, English settlement was Jamestown. Now, it happened in 1607. Now, in 1907, 400 years later, they had a big celebration, and the Queen herself, Queen Elizabeth, who's descended from King James I. Jamestown was named after James I, the king at that time. But Queen Elizabeth came over to celebrate along with the Americans, Queen Elizabeth II. But anyway, now, you know what I said, permanent in English. The actual oldest city in what is today the United States is St. Augustine in Florida, just off the Atlantic coast, just south of Jacksonville. St. Augustine, and they still have some of the buildings there that were original. But St. Augustine was a Spanish settlement, not English. But the first English settlement was Jamestown. It barely survived. Eventually, now here's one time, folk, where it looks like the government taking over was the right thing to do. The private company that was running it ran it poorly. Finally, the government took over, and the government straightened things out to where that things got a little bit better. This is one of the few times when government interference helped. The Indians they ran into were led by a chieftain named Powhatan, who was the father of Pocahontas. Powhatan died. His brother Opechacano took over. If you want me to, I can write that down. It's Opechacanough. Opechacana. He made an all-out assault on a colony. Here was a problem. He waited too long. Just like in Massachusetts later, just like in Virginia, the Indians waited too long. Now, in the case of the Spanish, they hit the islands first and then used the islands as a stepping stone to get to the mainland. But in the case of the Indians who encountered the British, the Indians simply waited too long. Opechacana killed about a third of the white man living in Virginia, a third of the white people living in Virginia, but the white men who were left rose up, they killed him. Then they forced the Indians to move out and move west, and again, I can't fault them for it. But this led to problems because the Indian problem now will not move any farther than this. We all know that what happened. The white man came in more numbers, he ran out of land, so he encroached on the Indian land. And with all respects, I will hear this from a white man. The white man was not keeping his promises to the Indians. You're going to hear that from a white man. This is standard history. And it happened again. George Washington himself, after he made a treaty, he said, in order for me to enforce it, I would need the entire army to keep the white settlers out. And he said, we don't have the money or the resources to do that, so what was he to do? Like I say, he made the treaty, but then the white settlers moved in anyway. The Indians fought them, and the whites rose up and drove the Indians out. Again, if you can think of a better solution, I'd like to listen to it. Now, one problem that the Virginia colony had was at first only men came over. The first women came over in 1619, the first men in 1607. So from 1607 to 1619, there were no no women. And then, even then, until the end of the 1600s, there was a severe shortage of women. Basically there weren't enough women to go around, but eventually that changed as the older colonists died off and the new colonists that lived to reproduced half men and half boys and half girls. And eventually the numbers evened out, but it wasn't until the end of the 1600s. Now, eventually the Virginia colony became what we call polarized. And I want you to learn this because we're going to run into it later. Polarized, in this case, polarized means that the rich became very, very rich, and the poor were very, very poor, with hardly anyone in between. In other words, at first, like, they were all in poverty, but some of the more enterprising, the ones who had good luck, rose up, while the others stayed in poverty, and there was nobody in between. Now, we're going to run into this word again because eventually the country became polarized over the issue of slavery, as some people came to believe in it very, very strongly, and others came to disbelieve in it equally as strongly, and everybody had to take sides. That's to come later. But polarized, and today's America might be becoming polarized also, with people who want socialism and people who don't. And eventually it could lead to conflict. But anyway, what made the persons who were rich get rich was John Rolfe, the same one who married Pocahontas, had learned something about raising tobacco that the Indians never had learned. He learned that you could mix this strain with that strain and get a hybrid type of tobacco that was better than any other kind of tobacco that they had had before. So he got a really high quality, high type of tobacco, and tobacco sold really well in Europe. So that's how the colonies, the Virginians got their wealth, by raising tobacco. Now, I will say this, Sir Walter Raleigh smoked in front of Queen Elizabeth I, but James I, who came next, outlawed tobacco in his court. He said tobacco has a bad odor to it, and it's habit forming, it's addictive, and I don't want it anywhere near me. This was as long ago as the early 1600s, folk. A lot of people began to be suspicious of it. And also, they noticed that the persons who used it, and hopefully none of you know what I'm talking about, but the persons who used it became addicted to it, and they couldn't quit. This still goes on. All right. Now, because of tobacco, though, and the money that could be made, more and more Englishmen wanted to come to the colonies. But a lot of these people who wanted to come couldn't afford the passage. So they set up a system of indentured servanthood. An indentured servant was a person who in England was too poor to pay for his passage to come across the ocean. So he would borrow the money and pay it back with his labor. He'd oftentimes work for a period of several years, maybe 6 years, 7 years, but sometime maybe 10 years. But he'd work for several years, and after that he was free. And once he was free, he could work again to build up his own land, to find a vacant lot and farm on that vacant lot and grow tobacco. But a lot of the persons who came to the Carolinas and to Maryland and Virginia, what your book calls the Chesapeake colonies, that includes Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, a lot of these persons were indentured servants. Now, as for the Maryland colony, England became a Protestant country, and they persecuted Catholics. And folk, again, I want to say that, and in no way do I want to promote this, but anti-Catholic sentiment was a big problem in American history all the way down through. And as recently as 1960, when I was 11 years old, and we had a Catholic running for president, John Kennedy by name, there was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment. And again, I don't want to promote it, I don't believe in it, I don't agree with it, but nevertheless, I have to teach about it because it was there. The Ku Klux Klan was not just anti-African, they were anti-black, anti-Catholic also, and anti-Jew. the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s, among other things, was strongly anti-Catholic. It was a strong movement. And anyway, Lord Baltimore realized that Catholics were being persecuted in England. He was a Catholic himself, so he founded a colony in Maryland, but he did not keep Protestants out, and eventually Maryland became still strongly Catholic, but it became more Protestant than Catholic, and eventually the Maryland colony became a lot like the Virginia colony, and eventually Catholic and Protestants learned to work together in some kind of harmony while they disagreed theologically. The Spanish, and I didn't mention it, but I'll mention now, a lot of the Spanish men, because of the shortage of women, they married Indian women. And this created a class struggle in Latin America where you still have the pure Europeans, the mixed Europeans, the mixed African and Indian, the mixed African and European, the mixed Indian European. Each of these classes have a different name, which I did not go into and won't. Except for John Wolfe, most of your English colonists did not marry Indian women. Maybe because they consider themselves better than the Indian women or whatever. Also, there is a story going around that almost every Indian had syphilis. And that's how it got into Europe, carried by one of Columbus's, or more than one of Columbus's crewmen. And syphilis greatly shortened their lives. This story has gotten around, and maybe the English knew that. But anyway, very few English married Indian women. As for John Rolfe and Pocahontas, they had one son named Thomas Wolfe. Millions of Americans today claim that they are descended from Thomas Wolfe, descended from Pocahontas and John Wolfe. But anyway, now,
What's the special relationship? Like, what do you mean if you descended, you get back?
in other words, they are proud of the fact that we are descended from some famous person.
Okay.
Yeah, in other words, we're descended from, Pocahontas is one of the most famous women in American history. If you grow up in America, you'll read a lot of books about Pocahontas. There's been movies made about her. She's one of the more famous women there are. Oh yeah, and in one of the movies, they had Pocahontas convert John Smith to animism. This is not the case. Instead, Pocahontas converted to Christianity. Your book says it was a forced conversion, but it proved to be genuine in the long run. She actually did convert, really. But anyway, all right, now in 1619, three things happened. I'm not going to write that year down. You don't have to remember that year, but not only were women brought over, but slaves were brought from the West Indies. Initially, the slaves did not come directly from Africa, but it came to the West Indies. And so slavery began. And in addition, the colonists met for the first time in a house called the House of Burgesses, and this was the beginning of democracy. Now, here's the sad truth about the House of Burgesses. At first, anyone could participate, and everyone could vote. But as time went on, they said only people who own property can vote, and the rest of you, phooey on you. And this idea of only property owners vote or serve on juries, they still existed in some place up until the time my father was a young man. He was born in 1920. Throughout the 2030, there were still places where to serve on a jury, you had to be a property owner. Today, though, a lot of places, they'll take only persons who voted in the last election. I served on a jury twice, my wife once. But they started out, they allowed anyone, then they only allowed the more wealthy to vote. Yes?
Didn't they only allow white male?
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. I thought that was obvious, but yes, they only allowed white men to vote. Yes, property owning white men. Not.
What year is this supposed to be?
1619. Yeah, three things happened.
Okay.
They brought in women, brought in slaves, and set up and met in the House of Burgesses and made laws. Now, the laws had to be approved by the King of England, and this eventually led to conflict because they might make a law, and it would take 4 months before the King of England heard about it. Then 4 more months for a ship to arrive that the King of England approved. That meant a law would take 8 months to actually become effective. And this was one of the things eventually was to lead to conflict. All of you, I hope, know already that we wound up fighting a war against England and winning. I mean, I hope all of you know that. Yeah. England had 13 colonies over here, and Georgia was one of the 13 colonies. And the 13 colonies rebelled, you know. But we'll get into things that led up to it. Now, one of the first events that led to the rebellion was a man named Bacon. Bacon was a member of the poor class. I mean, he was a poor man, but he got together a group of followers. The issue was, at first, the issue was Indians. I've already mentioned how that the Indians were promised, we whites will never move beyond this point. Well, they ran out of land, the whites did, so they moved into Indian territory. The governor said, oh no, this is wrong. So the governor sent a militia out to stop the whites, and Bacon got a militia together, and they started fighting among themselves. Then the war became not just a war over the Indians, but a class war, a class struggle between Europeans, between the rich and the poor, class struggle between the rich and the poor. Bacon died of dysentery. Well, skipping one detail, I'm going to put this detail back in. The Virginia legislature passed a law that only the rich could vote. But then the governor decided he'd call a special election, which he did, and to his surprise, Bacon and his men won handily. I mean, if you talk about an unexpected outcome, the last election, presidential election we had an unexpected outcome. Well, this was an unexpected outcome also. Bacon got a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses along with the other rebels, and the elites became really alarmed. They said, these people outnumber us and they're going to take over. Eventually, though, Bacon died suddenly, probably of dysentery, and the governor hung 13 poor people. But he had a problem with it. The King of England heard about it, and the King of England became very upset. He said, this governor of mine, he's killing my people. So the king sent another governor to replace Governor Berkeley, the original governor. But this was like the first rebellion of colonies, and it was rebellion against the poor against the rich. But it's believed that it was to eventually lead to a rebellion against England from other country. But anyway, this was the first rebellion of Englishmen against Englishmen. When the new governor was sent, he wound up giving the poor people almost everything they'd fought for. Now, folk, this reminds me of the peasant rebellions in Germany. The peasants rose up during Martin Luther's day, and they killed a bunch of nobility, but they lost. But when the nobility made peace, they wound up giving the peasants almost everything the peasants demanded because they didn't want another rebellion. The peasants greatly outnumbered the nobility, and also the peasants were getting guns and getting longbows and crossbows that could penetrate armor. And the nobles realized we've got to make peace with these people because they greatly outnumber us. So eventually this was to lead to Europe becoming more and more democratic. The gun, I mean, folk, that's still a hot issue. It's not one of the things I actually write about, but carrying guns. Hitler believed in gun control. He took German people's guns away. I don't believe in gun control. Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms, and the Supreme Court just recently ruled that this Second Amendment is still valid. Yes?
I have questions. Since, I'm under 21,
Yeah.
I'm allowed to buy like a shotgun or like a rifle. Am I allowed to keep that in my car since my car is like it's an extension of my home, or?
You had better get some expert advice on that. I do not know. You better get someone who really genuinely knows. If any of you know the answer, if you're under 21, I think you better be really, really discreet about carrying it. If you're under 21. Now, my youngest son just turned 21. Well, he turned 21 back in May, so he can carry one. But anyway, I don't know what the law is in your case.
Yeah, because we need to bear arms too, and then we have these people with guns, and we're not allowed to carry arms.
Well, yeah, well, that's why they, in your case right here, you being under 21, I mean, it carries a whole nother statute, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but like he's saying, just look it up.
You better get some expert advice, because you can get in a lot of trouble for having one.
Do you live in your car?
Me?
Yes.
No.
Okay, and so you're gonna run into that along the way, so you have residents, you have guidelines you have to follow up to a certain age. Because even though the state of Georgia sees you as an adult at the age of 17, but carrying a firearm is a little bit more.
Right. Anyway, okay. All right, now, going to Florida, New Mexico, your book lumps them together. Now, Florida, New Mexico at this time were Spanish colonies. And yes, what I'm teaching you is history that we did not learn when I was in school, but again, Florida is a state, and so is New Mexico, so I'm going to teach it because I think I should. Florida and New Mexico were into Spanish. In Florida and New Mexico, there were not enough Spaniards moved into either of those places to ward off the Indians. In both places, the Indians tended to get the upper hand, and this was especially true in New Mexico. The Spanish would oftentimes die during their explorations, and their horses would get loose and run around loose. And horses are one of the few animals you can capture in the wild and tame, learn how to break them in, and it's a task, but some of you who know anything about, of course, I grew up watching old Western movies and movies about Jesse James, Hopalong Cassidy, 26 Men, Wagon Train, Jefferson Drum, The Lone Ranger, The Rifleman. Any of you ever heard of any of these? The Rifleman, well, the others of them have been long forgotten about. The Western used to be what you'd see every evening on TV. Every channel, every evening, some Western. And but anyway, the Indians learned how to corral these horses, trap them, tame them, break them. I mean, you get on a horse for the first time, he does not want to be ridden. And he will buck and he'll try to throw you off, but eventually he'll quit and bow down, and you might say, yeah, that's his signal that he has agreed to be a servant to man. And he does, when the horse gets protected and gets fed, and anyway, but the Indians became excellent horsemen, and again, the Spanish could not fight them, could not conquer them. Some of the Indians, though, were forced to pay tribute and forced to build churches and forced to convert it to Christianity. But again, in the long run, they rebelled. The Indians outnumbered the Spaniards in both places by 20 to 1. You can pick the winner, at least temporarily. Now, Florida eventually was taken over by the United States, as was New Mexico, and in both cases, the white man moved in such numbers that overwhelmed the Indians. Now, in the long run, you talk to a Seminole Indian. The Seminole were forced to flee all the way to the Everglades, where the white men would not go. The Seminole will brag that we never surrendered to the white man. This is true. They have never surrendered. But in New Mexico, those Indians, the Pueblo Indians did, and they were almost wiped out. But they eventually surrendered. Only with the Americans. Again, the Spanish and Mexicans could not get their people to move into these territories. That's ironic, because today they're moving in droves and we're trying to keep them out. But in those days, they tried to get them in, the Spanish government. And in fact, one Spanish governor of both New Mexico and Florida said, the only people that come in here are lazy drifters who just want handouts and don't want to work. The industrious people never came. Again, all this is in your book. Slavery was to become a problem. Slavery found its way into Virginia and the Carolinas. And it was to continue all the way up until the Civil War. All right. Now, so far then, first 3 chapters. What have we gotten? We've gotten talked about the American Indians before Columbus. Went from there to when the Europeans came and what they found. what they expected to find, and their explorers. And then from there to the first English colonies. Sir Walter Raleigh dreamed that someday North America would be filled with English-speaking people. He did not live to see his dream fulfilled, as was the case of so many people who ingratiate themselves to the ruler. Sir Walter Raleigh ingratiated himself to Queen Elizabeth, only to be killed by Elizabeth's successor, James I. He and James had a falling out, and we have a falling out with the king. Oh my. All right, but anyway, eventually North America was filled with this English-speaking people. Now, Florida, oh yeah, that's so unique in view of what happened. If you ever wondered why the capital of Florida is located in Tallahassee, folk, until the early 1900s, Florida consisted mostly of the northern part of Florida, and the southern part was looked on as being a worthless wasteland. Now that's surprising in view of the fact that cities like Miami is there, and Orlando, and Disney World, and Naples, but at the time Florida was nothing, looked on being nothing. So the people who moved into Florida only moved into the northern part. They set up a plantation system like we had in Georgia and Alabama, and they tried to grow cotton like they do in Georgia and Alabama, and the rest of Florida was just simply neglected. The Spanish wouldn't move in, but eventually it became a play area, a resort area. All right, with that in mind, I thought, what if I run out of things to talk about? I'm going on to chapter 4. What if I run out of chapter 4? Now, your book divides itself into the southern colonies and the northern colonies. And again, all of you I hope know. I hope you know two things before coming in. Number one, the United States fought a war against Britain and rebelled. And number two, I hope you know already that we fought a big war among ourselves that lasted 4 years and killed 500,000 people. We call it the Civil War, sometimes called the war between the states. So you'll see me make reference to until the Civil War, this was so, until the Civil War, that was so. But anyway, until the Civil War, your book divides up into the northern colonies and the southern colonies. The northern colonies, that's the area from Pennsylvania on up, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and New England states, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Vermont, and New Hampshire. That's, anyway, that's the north. Now, in the case of the northern colonies, your book opens up with a big net about Roger Williams, so I'll open up with the story of Roger Williams also. The New England colonies, unlike the Virginia colonies, where the economics was the biggest factor, with the New England colonies, it appears that religion was their biggest factor. Some historians will try to make it sound like economics, but religion was the number one thing that got the New England colonies started. The New England colony started off, unlike the Virginia colony, it started off with an equal number of men and women. Now, the first New England settlers were a group of people called the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came from a group of people called the Separatists. Now, who were the Separatists?
People who...
All right, I might be throwing a lot at you, but in the case of England, all right, you got to back up to Henry VIII. Henry VIII was a contemporary of Martin Luther, and when Martin Luther set a reform, Henry VIII wrote a pamphlet denouncing Martin Luther. The Pope gave Henry VIII the title of Defender of the Faith, and the English kings and queens still have that as part of their official title, Defender of the Faith. But they no longer are defenders of the Roman Catholic faith, and you might know already, Henry VIII was the king who initially broke away from the Catholic Church. Now, here's a story, in brief. Henry's father, Henry VII, had taken over. Henry VII claimed to be descended from King Arthur. All of you may have heard the story of Arthur and the Knights of Round Table and Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. Maybe you haven't. One of the biggest parts of British literature. Anyway, King Henry VII had a son named Arthur, and Arthur was going to become Arthur II. So Henry II married off his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, who was related to Charles V, whom I already mentioned, the big emperor of Spain. This was designed to give a great deal of power to the English monarchy. Only problem was, before they got together, before the marriage was consummated, Arthur died. Well, the King of England